Louisiana Beer Reviews 26, Schlitz. Schlitz beer is one of the oldest brands of beer in the United States, having been introduced in 1849 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin by the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company. And except for Prohibition, it's been brewed continuously since then. I'm going to show you some items here in a minute. Here's a typical 12-ounce can of Schlitz beer. The beer that made Milwaukee famous, and that's another story. That's actually a true story. Schlitz was the beer that made Milwaukee famous, and it has something to do with the Chicago Fire of 1871. Until 1976, Schlitz was the second most popular beer brand in the United States, right behind Budweiser. It was a very popular beer. It had tremendous brand loyalty. But in the 70s, and by the way, that was one of the beers that I grew up hearing about all the time when I was young, little kid, people drinking Schlitz. Go for the Gusto commercials. You saw Schlitz towels, bathing suits, just everywhere, Gusto. But in the 70s, the Schlitz company did start to falter. They just weren't as well organized as Anheuser-Busch, and they started to sort of crumble under the advertising pressure of Anheuser-Busch. Sometime in the 60s, they made a slight recipe change, although I think that was just a relatively small change. Some people claim it was a big change. I don't believe that really. But their big problem came in the mid-70s when they got this new brewmaster who claimed he could save the company a lot of money by skipping a bunch of steps to expedite the beer production. Well, what happened was they produced some beer according to his method, and they had to dump 500,000 barrels of beer because it was tainted. This was all over the news, and people started to abandon the brand. Schlitz did bring in some new people, a new brewmaster who started cutting the bull, getting the stuff done right. They improved the brand, they improved the formula. Taste test showed that people liked it, but it was too late. The damage was done. People did not want to go back to Schlitz. People just thought it was bad. It had been ruined or whatever. And so even though they probably made the best Schlitz ever, the one that's been made since 1977, they lost their audience. So they started to decline more and more. They continued to try to advertise heavily, but it was just too late. And in 1982, because they had so much debt and they had union problems, the union threatened to go on strike, or they had a strike. The union helped themselves out by putting the company out of business, and they all lost their jobs. Actually, the company didn't go out of business. It was acquired by Stroh's. Stroh's just took over all of their breweries and facilities. Stroh's went around buying up a lot of struggling companies, but what happened to Stroh's was they ended up accumulating so much debt by buying up all these companies that they ended up falling apart, and they got bought out by Pabst in 1999. But Schlitz has not been an independent company since '82, and from that time it was relegated to the budget beer segment, and before that it was a premium beer. They made Schlitz Light for a good while, but in 2010, here's an old Schlitz Light glass. Here's a Schlitz Light plastic insulated mug. You saw these a lot in the 70s. Here's the famous Schlitz belt around the globe. That's one of their famous icons. But Schlitz just lost its audience. Did continue to have some loyal following. When I started drinking beer in 1996, I started to try everything, and I tried Schlitz, and I always thought it was very good. It gets a C+ on Beer Advocate. The bros give it a B-. Rate Beer gives it a so-so rating, kind of below average rating. The Beer and Me gives it a fine average, not a very good average. I'll show you a few things. Here's a bottle I got in 1999. It's a 12-ounce Schlitz bottle. It's one of the best looking bottles I've ever seen. In 2001, Schlitz stopped making beer in bottles. Well, Pabst Brewing Company stopped making Schlitz in bottles. And this was a really hard thing to find because you never really saw Schlitz in bottles. And I was so glad to get this attractive bottle in Houston, Texas. And that's one of my prized possessions in my collection. Here's a 1995 Schlitz can. It's a 50th anniversary can from, it's a memorial for the end of World War II. Genuine Schlitz beer brewed with just a kiss of the hops, and that's their big thing, just a touch of hops in their brewing process. A lot of this information is on the Pabst Brewing Company website. They talk about all the problems Schlitz had over the years. In 2007, Pabst, oh, one more thing. Here's Schlitz Ice. They came out with this in the 90s, trying to capitalize on the ice beer craze. This didn't last that long. They had a Schlitz Genuine Draft, didn't last, although they still do make the Schlitz Genuine Gold in Canada. In 2007, Pabst Brewing Company wanted to try to revitalize the Schlitz brand, and so what they did was they got together with some old people that worked for the Schlitz Brewing Company before it was bought out in '82, and they tried to, what they say, recreate the 60s original formula before it was revamped or slightly altered in the mid-60s. So what they came out with was Schlitz Gusto. Here's a bottle of the Schlitz Gusto. It's not sold in Louisiana. It's really only sold in Florida and up in the north, mostly in the Midwest. But they claim they're trying to spread it out around the country. In 2010, I believe it might have been late '09, they came out with the Schlitz, they call it Tall Boy can. And this is also the classic, so-called classic 60s formula. I say so-called because they had no records of what the formula or the original recipe actually was. Schlitz was in such disarray that when Stroh's took it over, they didn't even have records of what the original recipe was. So they had to, by just memory, try to recreate it. So it's really not the original recipe. It's just an attempt to try to mimic it. But anyway, oh, and here's some other Schlitz memorabilia. Schlitz 1981 football guide. This is at when Schlitz was on their last legs, trying to stay afloat. There's some real good stuff in this book. It talks about how to pour beer. They say you should pour beer aggressively down the middle of the glass to give it a lot of head, and they said you want it to have a thick head because that releases more flavor. Another thing, Schlitz was the first company in 1911, I think, but I could be wrong, to introduce beer in a brown bottle because they noticed that the beer would sour. It would get that skunkiness in the clear bottle. So Schlitz started the brown bottle packaging revolution. Here's 1982 Schlitz Beer Guide. I don't know if you can see this on here. This is when they redesigned their cans. It's their last attempt to recapture the audience, and they went more to a red label instead of the maroon label. It didn't work, and they just couldn't make it. Here's a nice Schlitz glass, and we're going to give this a try. I'm going to try to be open-minded, of course. I don't want to just say, oh, I'll always love Schlitz, so I'm going to automatically give it a good rating. No, I'm going to try to be fair with it. 16-ounce Schlitz can. You can still find Schlitz in a lot of places. It's hit or miss in Louisiana. Some stores carry it, others don't. But in Baton Rouge, it's really everywhere. New Orleans, it's kind of spotty, the distribution. Look at that thick head. you're going to always see that super thick white head on Schlitz beer. And it has a very clear straw appearance. Very clear, highly filtered. It's very carbonated also. The aroma, let's see, a lot of sweetness here. You get a lot of sweetness with Schlitz, and you can pick up the grain. Of course, they use water, barley malt. I'm thinking corn, a kiss of the hops, and yeast. But you get a stereotypical beer smell on the sweet side, but it's not unlike, really that much unlike Coors or Miller High Life or Miller Genuine Draft or Budweiser, anything like that, Old Milwaukee. But it's a very pleasant smell, to be frank. Now to give it the most important thing, excuse me, the taste test. This helps, my throat was dry. You have the grains. You do have a kiss of the hop bitterness midway through the sip and at the end to round it out. Schlitz is light-bodied, light and watery. The drinkability is very high. So it's a very easy drinking beer, perfect to have with lunch, which I'm going to have the rest of this with lunch. People will disparage it, and I think the main thing they disparage it with is it's really psychological, because they see it as a cheap beer and they think it's bad. They don't give it a chance. Well, it's sold on a budget level, that's true, but it's still made according to the same recipe they've been having since 1977, which was a premium beer. So if you're going to pay almost $20 a case for Budweiser, you're not going to get anything that's better than what you're going to get with this for $14.99 a case. And in fact, you could almost say that Schlitz rivals Budweiser and Coors. I'm going to it's just a good, solid American style lager. If you like American style lager beers, then you're going to like Schlitz. It's just really a delicious beer. I give it a B+ still. I would like to see it get popular again, but Pabst Brewing Company, their owner, is not a wealthy company. They sort of struggle along themselves, so it's doubtful that you're going to see a lot of advertising for Schlitz. But it does have a following. I mean, it hit rock bottom in 2001 when it was less than 1 million barrels produced, and that's when they stopped making it in bottles, and you really didn't see it much, but sort of had a little resurgence lately. I don't know what the production numbers are. I'm sure it's not real high, but it's got to be fairly good, because I just see cases of it and 6-packs of these, usually 6-packs of these 16-ounce cans in the store. So it's got a niche following. It has a loyal following. People out there realize that Schlitz is a credible beer. It's delicious. They do buy it. I recommend it. Definitely give it a try if you haven't tried it, or if you hadn't had it in many years. Laissez le bon temps rouler. I'm going to end this review by saying, y'all come on down to New Orleans.